in my journey to faith, which took so long because I'm so stubborn, but like in my journey to faith, the Marquis de Sade, who invented sadism, where we get the word sadism, he was a huge influence on me, because at one point when I became an atheist, I started reading atheist philosophy. And I would read the existentialists, and I read all the different atheists, and I said, this doesn't make sense. This doesn't hold together. This doesn't hold together. And then I got to the Marquis de Sade, who said, no, we should, rape and kill people because it gives us joy. And that's what nature does, and there's no God, so why not? And I thought, that makes sense. And that's when I stopped being an atheist, because I thought, if that's where that's going, I'm not going there.
But see, that's right. That takes some kind of courage and intellectual honesty to see where it's going.
Right.
And so when you read, God forbid people read Marquis de Sade, people don't realize how horrific some things actually can be. That like you don't want to read it, because it's really horrifying. It can mess you up. It's so bad. It's scary. It's like, if you take that pill, you could die. Like, be careful. And what he's talking about, again, to see things that clearly, to say, okay, listen, there's no God, therefore there's no good or evil. But most people can't accept that. They say, well, I don't like God, but I like the idea of good and evil, and what I believe is good, and they're not honest about it. So Nietzsche is honest about it, Marquis de Sade is honest about it, and it takes you to a place so dark that it's scary. Welcome. This is the first Socrates in the Studio session with my guest, Andrew Klavan. Andrew, no pressure. It's the first. This is the first. Now,
I could destroy this whole.
I know you could blow this whole thing into the future. It just simply won't exist.
That's why I'm here.
Because of the failure of what we're about to do. No, so there's really no audience. If you hear people laughing, I don't know who they are. This is meant to be just a conversation between us, and yet there are a few people here in the shadows. They're not going to be on camera because they're hideous. But the fact of the matter is that this really is the first Socrates in the City session, and as I told you earlier, and as people will know, the conversation that we had a year ago, it's amazing that it's a year ago, about your book, The Truth and Beauty, it was so wonderful that I thought, I want to continue the conversation. And I couldn't find the money because people don't like you, and it was just hard. And I said, how can we do this?
Something I said.
Yeah, it was something you said. No, I really just thought you're one of those figures to whom I could talk for almost endlessly. And so when we had the Socrates in the City event a year ago, which everyone should go watch on YouTube or on the Socrates site before this, because that was kind of like the seminal where we covered the basics. But I just thought, let's keep going, because there's so much in the book. I wanted to touch on the subject of the book called The Truth and Beauty, how the lives and works of England's greatest poets point the way to a deeper understanding of the words of Jesus. In our previous session a year ago, we talked about how you got the idea to do this, but reprise the basics of it. For example, where you get the title, The Truth and Beauty.
Yeah, it comes from Keats, the Ode on a Grecian Urn, which ends with beauty is truth, truth, beauty. That's all you know on earth and all you need to know. And
pretty arrogant of Keats.
Well, he puts it in some versions it's in quotation, so it's the urn speaking. So it's the Grecian urn that's right. Being arrogant. But basically, I find these poets, all of them on a single island in two generations, the greatest English poets who ever live, except for Milton and Shakespeare, maybe.
Who preceded them, obviously.
Right. But they're all facing the same problem. The great critic Jacques Barzin said the only way to define the Romantics is there are so many different ones. There are liberals, there are conservatives, there are believers, there are non-believers, but they're all facing the same problem, which was that the entire structure of European thought and belief was collapsing, and it presented certain difficulties. Basically, the church had come under question, all religion had come under question, faith was coming under question. It was for the first time you could be an atheist or at least a non-theist and and actually talk about it. And these guys had to reconstruct the world. They had to rebuild the world. And
it's hard to believe that happened then. I mean, that's one of the joys of this book, is that you remind us of something that we should all know.
Yeah.
That what we feel is new is in fact just a new iteration of something that began in this period.
Well, it's been happening for 500 years. It's been happening basically since the Reformation, but then also the scientific revolution. And it has now reached a place that people predicted it was going to reach, but it hadn't yet. But people saw it. That's the thing about poets. They're like prophets. They see things coming, even if they don't know it. They describe the present world so minutely that you can detect the future in it.
What do you mean? Because I don't want to wrap up what you're saying about the Romantic period. But what do you mean that now it's gotten to this point? Let's touch on that briefly, and then we'll come back to it.
Well, as this that is sometimes called the disenchantment of the world, as this idea that the world was a material place, a clockwork that could be described, and the planets weren't moved by the angels. There were forces, natural forces that took place. And as that gave way to Darwin, and we ourselves were just this kind of random creation of a random nature, people started to say, well, this is going to have an effect. And the one who's most often cited is Nietzsche, who said, God is dead, we killed him. And so now we're going to have to become gods. And what he meant by that was certain kinds of men, who called supermen, are going to have to find their way beyond the categories of good and evil,
right,
to create an entirely new web of being and perception.
Did he specifically use the phrase Klaus Schwab?
he had a picture of
Did he prophetically?
Yes, that was.
But how interesting. I mean, to be reminded of it, because it's not as though I hadn't heard that before. But that Nietzsche calls it, that he sees it.
He calls
at the end of the 19th century.
And the other person who calls it before Nietzsche even starts writing it, though Nietzsche was fascinated by him, is Dostoevsky, who has one of the brothers, Karamazov, Ivan, who is the brother who, it's not that he doesn't believe in God. He rejects God. He thinks there is a God, but he thinks the world is too cruel to follow God, and that God has basically blown it. And there's nothing God can do to make it up to us how cruel the world is. And what he says is, if there's no God, for every man who stops believing in God and immortality, not only will the moral world collapse, not only will his moral ideas collapse, but they'll become absolutely reversed. And the ego will become so important it'll become so important to serve the ego, even to the point of evil, which will essentially have become good. And I think that that's a lot of what we're looking at right in this moment, and the fact that it's connected to the loss of faith, and the fact that it's connected to the slow draining of faith over 500 years makes it almost invisible to us that this thing has finally come to pass.
Wow, this is depressing. Can we cut? No, seriously,
I have that effect on a lot of people.
This is so beautiful in a way, because you're teasing out some things. What you just said, you talk about, I mean, there is an innocence to the way the Romantics or that period processed this compared to where we are now.
Well, for one thing, they had the French Revolution, and they thought, oh, this solves the problem. Kill the priests, kill the kings, everything will be great.
Just a little murder.
Just a little
yeah,
bit.
Just enough.
But unfortunately, that didn't work out as well as they thought it would. And like the collapse of the Soviet Union in our time, there were people who said, oh, that actually disproves their thesis that this is going to save the world. And as in our time, there are plenty of people like Bernie Sanders and people like that who just think, no, it's fine. It just happened to go wrong this time, but next time it'll work. And Wordsworth, most importantly, he was the guy who saw the French Revolution, and he said, this is bliss, this is wonderful. Everything, all the injustices in the world will be swept away. And then he went to France, and he saw priests murdered in the street, and over time he came back and said, you know what, this is an utter failure. And in fact, the traditions of Britain are more important and more urgent to maintain than I thought they were. And he started to have to rebuild the idea of what it means to be a human being. And what's, to me, one of the kind of wonderful through lines in the book is the work of Samuel Coleridge, who was, of all of them, he may have been one of the most brilliant men who ever lived. He may have been one of the 10 most brilliant. He was just an absolute polymath. He knew everything. And in those days, you could know everything. There still wasn't that kind of specialization.
It's often said that Milton was the last human being who had read everything because, in terms of the world of printing, and that he had read everything that could be read at that time. After that, so much was written that nobody could do that. But you're saying, in a sense, Coleridge was like that.
I think he was the last man to know everything there was. And of all the great romantics, he was the one who was actually a believer, a Christian. And his Christianity waffled and changed and morphed, but he was always a Christian. And each of the great poets were touched by him in a different way, because all he ever did was talk. He met him and he just talked. And every time he talked to people, they changed. And one of the people he talked to over the course of a long year was Wordsworth. And so he found Wordsworth in the midst of the failure of the French Revolution, and they just started talking. And to talk to Coleridge was basically to listen. You were just listening constantly. And at the end of that time, they wrote one of the greatest books of poetry ever written, called Lyrical Ballads. And it completely rewrote the rules of poetry. It rewrote everything, but it also rewrote what it meant to be a human being. Where was the human being located? If he wasn't located, if the church wasn't telling you where he was located, if he wasn't located in the heavens, where was he? What made your perceptions real? I mean, all of this is what Hamlet was dealing with with Shakespeare was dealing with in Hamlet, where he has Hamlet say, because I'm depressed, the things that are usually beautiful are ugly. So therefore, how do I know whether things are beautiful or ugly? What do those categories mean? And those are the kinds of questions they were dealing with. And I think because the main highway of Western thought went in one direction, and the Romantics went in another direction, and kind of into a dead end because they didn't have faith anymore.
What did they say in Lyrical Ballads, or in others, when you say that they put forth this thesis about, what is a human being, or what effectively are they putting out?
To put it as simply as possible, it basically that the experience of being human is a collaboration between creation, or what Wordsworth at one point calls the one great mind, between creation and the human spirit, and that is a legitimate collaboration. In other words, that is a reality. The rainbow is the symbol of this. Wordsworth has a poem where he says, "My heart leaps up when I behold a rainbow in the sky. So was it when my life began. So is it now I am a man. So be it when I shall be old, or let me die. Let me die if I don't take pleasure in the rainbow." And the reason he was saying that is because Newton had recently shown that a rainbow is a real thing. You can't put the light back together. Once the light is separated, it is a real thing. But the only place it appears as a rainbow is in the human eye. And so it's a reality that only becomes itself through human perception. And what they were beginning to realize is everything is like that.
Okay, but this is like the deification of subjectivity?
Well, that's what a lot of people think.
A lot of dumb people like me?
Well,
is that what you're saying?
No, because there were so many different romantics who said so many different things. But Coleridge specifically said, thinking through how are we going to know whether the subjective experience is real or not? The experience of beauty, the experience of truth, the experience of good and evil. And he said he believed that Jesus Christ was what he called the sensorium, the model for checking our perception against the perception of reality. And that once you have that solves the puzzle for you. And each person he talked to became greater for talking to him, even when they didn't know why. Wordsworth ultimately became a Christian himself, but it took him a long time. And the other one who was deeply affected by one conversation with Coleridge was John Keats, and he died too young to know where he would have gone. But he was certainly a believer of a kind.
Well, when you talk about, there's a few threads here. You were saying that they, during this period, could see that something's collapsing.
Yep.
And it has to do with many things. It has to do with Newton inadvertently making it seem like, it's all mechanics. Now, it's funny, it's ironic, because Newton himself didn't believe that, but he puts forth this idea of so people go, so it's all just these forces, these forces, and there's nothing transcendent, nothing beyond the mechanics and whatever. So if I'm tracking with you, you're saying that the Romantics felt like we can work with this. We can create some kind of reality, or did that's not what I'm clear about.
They started to think, well, where is this person located? Because they still all, one of the things that hadn't happened yet, that has happened to us, was they hadn't lost what sociologists call the habitus, the outlook that had been created by 1,500 years of Christianity. So they still knew what was true and what was not true. They just had to find a way to justify their knowledge because it was falling apart. That faith was falling apart around them.
But it's interesting. It's kind of like cheating, right? In other words,
yes, it was.
It's like, well, it's like, I guess one version of this is the people who all somehow knew that the ethics of Jesus were superior, but they didn't like the miracles, but they said, but can we keep the ethics and get rid of the miracles? Can we make him a great moral teacher, but get rid of the idea that he's God incarnate, whatever? And that's the 19th century and so on and so forth. So that's part of what's happening here among the figures you're describing.
Yeah, the only one who really understood it was Coleridge because he knew everything. And he was the one who got it.
That helps.
And so he would go and talk to them, and each one, when he talked to them, suddenly became a better, like he made Wordsworth a genius. And after Coleridge would go away, they kind of sink back. Wordsworth lost his talent in some ways after Coleridge went away. He started writing some of his later poetry just really bad. And he knew it. He knew he had gone off the rails. And Keats is in absolute despair. His brothers died. He's out of money. His books are being absolutely torn apart by the critics. Bumps into Coleridge in a park and has a 45-minute conversation with him and goes off and writes the great odes, the ode to the Grecian urn, the ode to autumn, the greatest poetry since Shakespeare. It is the greatest poetry, English poetry since Shakespeare. And so Coleridge was like this little spirit who would implant what he saw and go away, and then these guys would suddenly become greater than they had ever been, and then kind of fade away again.
It's interesting just talking about the history of, the end of faith or the disenchantment and how that process goes along. I don't remember if in The Truth and Beauty, the book that's here, if you talk about Dover Beach and Matthew Arnold. Do you?
I do quote it there, yeah.
Because talk about that a little bit, because it's just so fascinating. Again, we kind of act like, well, this has happened in our time. It's the 60s or something. Yeah. And it's like, no, it happened, it happened in the 20s. It happened, you can trace it back roughly to this period that we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, there's this great shock that is Darwin and evolution and this idea that we are these random things. And if you ever want to read a great poem about this, it's Tennyson's In Memoriam, where one of his best friends dies, and he writes over the course of months, he writes this long poem mourning his friend's death. And all throughout it, he's struggling with this tremendous pain about his faith. He can't quite find it again. His wife is kind of smacking, just believe, just shut up and believe. But he keeps thinking, he says at one point, nature is red in tooth and claw. And when he looks at Darwin, it's not the randomness of evolution, it's not the mechanics of evolution that bothers him, it's the complete disregard with which species were wiped off the face of the earth. How can there be a good God when entire species just disappear in the course of millennium? And so, no, this is a struggle between the human heart, which has now had implanted over 1,500 years, has had Christ implanted in it, in the same way the Jews had the law implanted in their hearts so they could recognize Christ, so they could produce Christ. Now Christ has been implanted in the human heart, and suddenly the science seems to be taking it away.
Right.
And this is the thing, this is for me, one of the great themes that you have to understand in every given moment. We live in time, and our ideas as human beings develop over time. It made perfect sense after Newton for people to think, it's a clockwork universe. It didn't really make sense even then, but it was kind of a legitimate extrapolation. We're not all scientists. You hear that, there's gravity and things spin in a certain way, and you realize that the people who wrote the Bible didn't really understand how science worked, and so it must all be untrue.
It's a strong temptation in every epic to say, now we figured it out.
And you have to think, exactly, you have to think it through. And because it's an idea unfolding, it feels to the human mind like progress. But it may just be you're going through You've gone through a journey. I've gone through a journey. Part of my journey was atheism. I don't look back and say that was an error. I thought it was a footstep I had to take to get to the next place. Now, obviously it was incorrect, but I had to go through it in order to see the next thing. And that's, I think, what was happening then. They had to go through this period of materialism, of mechanism, of thinking it's all a clockwork. But it was never true.
But it sounds like what you're saying is that on some level, they knew that couldn't be right.
Some of them.
Some of them.
Some of them knew. I mean, all through Coleridge knew, C.S. Lewis knew, people sparked who knew. But a lot of people didn't really think it through. Nietzsche knew, and Dostoevsky. They're the ones who more than anything understood what was going to happen. Dostoevsky writes before Nietzsche ever writes a word, and yet all of Nietzsche's thought is in Dostoevsky. He sees it coming.
Well, because it's logical.
It's logical.
It's logical.
Exactly.
And what we're talking about, of course, is the idea that if you're honest, and because this is I think the story of we're living through it today, where people, they want the parts that they like and that they agree with, and they want to get rid of, and so they're trying to process how can we keep the parts we like and get rid of what we don't like, right? So with, Thomas Jefferson, he snips out the parts of the Bible that are miraculous and he keeps the wonderful ethics of Jesus.
Yeah.
And then you want to say, well, what's so wonderful about them? Maybe Jesus was just a nut and it's all wrong and you just like it, but you don't care that it's logically wrong. You're not being logical about this.
Right.
That if he wasn't God or whatever, on what basis do you say these ethics are so wonderful? And so you have this. It is funny how some people are willing to be utterly clear-eyed, like Nietzsche or Dostoevsky, or and say that if you get rid of God, this is what's going to happen. But you have all these other people thinking, well, no, wait a minute. We think we can make it work.
Yeah.
We can make this work somehow. And I would argue that instinct is evidence for God. That we have something within us that we can't escape because we are in fact made in God's image by God that knows something about truth. And so we can't really cold-bloodedly wipe it away and say it doesn't matter. We somehow sense that can't be right.
I think what you just said is absolutely right. And it's one of the things that non-believers keep stumbling over, the fact that if everything that we see is just an illusion, which is the deduction you have to come to if there's no God, you ultimately will come to the idea that that's why I think art falls apart. That's why you get abstract art where people put squiggles up there because they don't trust what the human being sees. But if everything that we see is an illusion, how come every time I walk toward Fifth Avenue, I hit Fifth Avenue? How come you can produce numbers which are imaginary things? There's no such thing as a 2, and yet I can produce numbers in such that they can predict when light's going to hit the Earth from 1,000,000 miles away and where and what's going to happen next. How does that happen? So we actually do have a connection, a collaboration with reality. And it's very, very hard to get to that place, the place where you have a collaboration with reality without God, ultimately. And if we have a sense that can do that with numbers, if we have a sense that can see light, the light we see isn't the light God sees, but it's the light humans see, then why shouldn't the morality that we see be morality? This is the whole reason why Dostoevsky has this character say that the good and bad are going to change over because all you've got then is your desires, basically. All you've got left are your ego.
Now that's interesting. You mentioned that a few minutes ago. The idea that it's the apotheosis of the ego, the will, which going back to Eden, I mean, it's that we can be as gods, so that what I want has to take precedence over everything else. So it's almost like baked into the system that God created.
Yeah.
That if you turn from Him, you become this Miltonic, Byronic, satanic figure, and it's inescapable. You want to rule, you want to reign in hell as long as it's your hell. I mean, it sounds like that's where that's going.
Well, this is why in my journey to faith, which took so long because I'm so stubborn, but like in my journey to faith, the Marquis de Sade, who invented sadism, where we get the word sadism, he was a huge influence on me because at one point when I became an atheist, I started reading atheist philosophy. And I would read the existentialists and I read all the different atheists and I'm saying, this doesn't make sense. This doesn't hold together. This doesn't hold together. And then I got to the Marquis de Sade who said, no, we should, rape and kill people because it gives us joy. And that's what nature does and there's no God, so why not? And I thought that makes sense. And that's when I stopped being an atheist because I thought if that's where that's going, I'm not going there.
But see, that's right. That takes some kind of courage and intellectual honesty to see where it's going.
Right.
And so when you read, God forbid people read Marquis de Sade, people don't realize how horrific some things actually can be. That like you don't want to read it because it's really horrifying. It can mess you up. It's so bad. It's scary. It's like, if you take that pill, you could die. Like, be careful. And what he's talking about, again, to see things that clearly, to say, okay, listen, there's no God, therefore there's no good or evil. But most people can't accept that. They say, well, I don't like God, but I like the idea of good and evil, and what I believe is good, and they're not honest about it. So Nietzsche is honest about it, Marquis de Sade is honest about it, and it takes you to a place so dark that it's scary.
Well, I think that's why, I don't know if this is happening to you, but it is happening a lot to me, so I suspect it is. I'm starting to talk to people who are not religious, who have started to talk in religious terms.
Yes.
They haven't changed.
Yes.
They haven't changed their belief system, but suddenly the word demonic is coming.
Yes.
Sometimes I hear people talking about the end of days, which, because I trust Jesus who said nobody knows when the end, I never talk about the end of days, but suddenly people who have no faith are telling me, this feels like the end times. This feels like something's coming to an end. And I think it is because this pattern that the Gospels and the Bible explain to us is kind of being revealed. It's kind of the skeleton is coming out of the body.
Well, it's kind of like the thing of running out of gas and being on fumes for a while.
Yes.
We've been on fumes for a while.
Yep.
Os Guinness has called it the cut flower society. It's like, well, that flower looks wonderful. And you realize, yes, and yet it's been cut, it is dying, it will die. Don't be fooled by the fact that it still looks wonderful. It'll only look wonderful for a little while. It's still got a little juice in the green fuse, and then it's over.
And Nietzsche called it the shadow of the dead God.
So what we're talking about is beginning to see the flower dying.